At Christmas, her mom called me a loser and put down my job. When I stood up, my fiancé said, "Respect my mom or leave." So I walked away. I thought I was marrying the love of my life, but one Christmas Eve dinner changed everything. By the time I left, I knew my future was on fire, and the woman I loved was holding the match. My job means I climb poles, brave storms, work with live wires, and sometimes get called out at 3 a.m. when a tree takes down half the grid. It's dangerous work, the kind where you don't get second chances if you mess up. But it pays well enough that I own my truck outright, have zero debt, and save good money every month. I wasn't rich, not by any stretch, but I had a steady job that literally kept the lights on for thousands of people. I never thought that would be something to apologize for. My fiancée, Elena, was incredible in so many ways. She was a graphic designer with real talent, the kind of person who could look at a blank screen and create something beautiful. But there was this crack running through her confidence that I didn't fully understand until I met her mother, Patricia. Patricia was one of those women who smiled while she twisted the knife, always perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, and always ready with a comment that sounded like concern but landed like criticism. She had this way of making Elena second-guess everything, from her career choices to her apartment to the men she dated. Over the 2 years we'd been together, I'd watched Elena shrink a little bit every time her mother called. The warning signs were there, I won't pretend they weren't, but I thought love and boundaries would be enough. Elena would hang up the phone and immediately start defending whatever her mother had just said, explaining that she was just worried or just wanted the best or just had high standards. I learned to bite my tongue because pushing back only made Elena defensive. I remember one call about 3 months before Christmas where Patricia spent 20 minutes questioning Elena's career choice, calling graphic design a hobby, not a profession. After Elena hung up, she spent the rest of the evening obsessively updating her portfolio, like she had something to prove. I asked her why she let her mother get in her head like that. Elena looked at me like I'd suggested she stopped breathing. She said Patricia had sacrificed everything to raise her and Daniel right after their father left, and the least she could do was listen to her mother's advice. That should have been my sign to run. But I loved Elena, or at least I loved the version of her that existed when her phone wasn't ringing. About a week before Christmas, Elena sat me down and gave me what I now realize was a warning she'd probably given to every guy before me. She told me her mother could be difficult, that she might ask personal questions, and that I should just smile and not take anything personally. When I asked what kind of questions, Elena looked away and said Patricia just liked to know who was in her daughter's life. I should have pressed harder, should have asked exactly what that meant, but I was confident in who I was and what I did, so I figured I could handle one dinner with a protective mother. Elena even coached me on topics to avoid. She told me not to mention that I'd bought my truck used or that I was still renting instead of owning. She said her mother had old-fashioned ideas about success, and it was easier to just avoid certain subjects. The fact that I needed a script for a family dinner should have told me everything, but I ignored it. Christmas Eve arrived, and we drove to Patricia's house in one of those affluent neighborhoods where every lawn looks like it was trimmed with scissors and every car in the driveway cost more than I made in a year. Elena was quiet the whole drive, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. When I asked if she was okay, she said she was fine, but could I please just try to make a good impression? I told her I always made a good impression, which was true in every other context of my life, but I didn't realize I was walking into an ambush. Elena's brother, Daniel, was already there with his fiancée, Sarah. Daniel was everything Patricia wanted in a son. He worked in finance, wore suits that probably cost what I spent on groceries in a month, and had this effortless way of talking about money without ever actually saying numbers. Sarah gave me this sympathetic look when we were introduced, and she actually pulled me aside while everyone was getting drinks and whispered that I should just agree with whatever Patricia said, that it wasn't worth fighting. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but I thanked her anyway. The dinner started fine. Patricia had gone all out with the decorations and the food. For the first hour, I actually thought maybe Elena had been overthinking things. We talked about safe topics, the weather, the food, some story about a neighbor's Christmas lights. I started to relax. Patricia even complimented my watch, which was nothing special but had been my grandfather's, and I thought maybe we were building some common ground. That was my mistake. Patricia refilled her wine glass and turned to me with that smile that didn't reach her eyes. She asked what I did for work. So, I told her I was a lineman. She tilted her head like she was trying to place the word, then asked if that was like a telephone repair person. I explained that I worked on power lines, the high-voltage transmission lines that kept electricity flowing to homes and businesses. Daniel jumped in with some comment about how essential workers are the backbone of society, which should have been supportive, but somehow felt condescending, like he was patting a dog on the head. Patricia nodded slowly before asking how much a job like that paid. The table went quiet for half a second before everyone pretended that was a normal question to ask someone you just met. Elena's hand tightened on my knee under the table, but I kept my voice steady and said I made around $70,000 a year, which was honest and nothing to be ashamed of. Patricia made this little humming sound, the kind that wasn't quite agreement or disagreement, just acknowledgement. Then she asked if there was room for growth in that field. I explained that I could move into management eventually or specialize in different types of installations, but the pay was solid and the benefits were good, and honestly, I liked the work. She nodded again, took another sip of wine, and said, "It must be nice to have a simple job where you didn't have to think too much." The table went completely quiet. Elena's grip on my knee went from warning to panic. Daniel suddenly became very interested in his plate, and Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice calm and told Patricia that actually, the job required constant problem-solving, technical knowledge, and quick thinking because one wrong move could seriously harm me or knock out power for an entire county. Patricia waved her hand like she was brushing away smoke and said she didn't mean it as an insult, just that some people were built for physical work, and some people were built for careers that required real education and intellectual capacity. I mentioned that I had an associate degree and multiple certifications that required years of training, but she'd already moved on. She asked about the ring, Elena's engagement ring, and specifically asked how much I'd spent on it. Elena tried to redirect, saying the ring was beautiful, and that was all that mattered. But Patricia talked right over her and said that a ring was an investment in a woman's future, a symbol of what a man could provide. She'd always told Elena never to settle for less than she deserved. The ring had cost me $4,000, a month's salary after taxes, and I'd saved for 6 months to buy it because I wanted Elena to have something beautiful. I told Patricia it was a personal question, and I'd rather not discuss finances at the dinner table, trying to be diplomatic, but she laughed and said that a man who was serious about providing for a family shouldn't be shy about discussing his financial capacity. Then she looked directly at me and said, Elena could have had her pick of men. Men with real careers and real prospects, doctors, lawyers, men like Daniel. She just wanted to make sure I understood what I was marrying into, that Elena had been raised with certain standards and expectations. Daniel tried to change the subject, suggesting we move on to dessert, but I was done being polite. I looked Patricia in the eye and told her that I understood exactly what I was marrying into, a woman I loved who deserved respect. And maybe if Patricia spent less time measuring people by their bank accounts and more time recognizing that character and stability mattered, she'd see that I was exactly the kind of man Elena needed. Patricia's face went cold, like someone had flipped a switch, and the pleasant hostess mask she'd been wearing just evaporated. She set down her wine glass very carefully and asked Elena if she was going to let me disrespect her mother like that in her own home. Elena looked between us, her face pale, her eyes wide, and I could see the exact moment she made her choice. The second where she decided her mother's approval was worth more than my dignity. She turned to me and said I needed to apologize to her mother or leave. Her voice was shaking, but her words were clear. The words hung in the air, and I realized that this wasn't about the dinner or the insults or even Patricia. This was about every future holiday, every family gathering, every moment where I'd be expected to smile and take it while Patricia picked me apart. And Elena would stand by and let it happen because that's what she'd been trained to do her entire life. I pushed back my chair, stood up, and said, "Okay." Elena's eyes went wider, like she'd expected me to argue or grovel or cave the way she always did, but I just grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and walked toward the door. As I was leaving, I heard Daniel say something under his breath that sounded like finally. And when I glanced back, Sarah was staring at Elena with this look of disappointment that told me this wasn't the first time this had happened. I heard Elena calling my name as I reached my truck, her voice getting higher and more desperate. But I didn't stop. I started the engine and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the driveway in the cold without a jacket. And I felt nothing but clarity. That was the moment I realized who she would choose when it mattered, and it wasn't me. I drove home in complete silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the sound of my truck on the highway and my own thoughts getting louder with every mile. By the time I pulled into our apartment building, my phone had 17 missed calls from Elena and a string of texts that started with apologies and ended with accusations. The first few messages were panicked, asking where I was and saying we needed to talk. Then they shifted to defensive, saying I'd embarrassed her in front of her family and that I knew how her mother could be. Finally, they landed on angry, telling me I was being dramatic and that if I just kept my mouth shut for one dinner, none of this would have happened. I read every single one sitting in my truck in the parking lot. And that's when it clicked. She wasn't sorry for what happened, she was sorry I hadn't played along. The apartment felt different when I walked in, like I was seeing it clearly for the first time. I realized how much of myself I'd been folding up to fit into Elena's life. I sat on the couch and stared at the walls. That's when I noticed Elena's laptop was open on the coffee table, still logged into her email. I wasn't planning to snoop, but the screen was facing me. I saw a message from Patricia with the subject line "re" on him, and my stomach dropped. I shouldn't have clicked it, but I did. The email chain went back months, and what I read made everything make sense in the worst possible way. Patricia had been sending Elena regular emails about me, detailed lists of my inadequacies, comparisons to other men Elena could have dated, links to articles about financial planning and the importance of marrying within your social class. But what destroyed me was Elena's responses. She wasn't defending me. She was agreeing with her mother, saying she had concerns, too, but that I was nice enough and she hoped she could encourage me to be more ambitious, that maybe after the wedding, she could push me toward a better career. There was one email from 2 months ago where Patricia asked point-blank if Elena was sure about marrying me or if she was just settling because she was getting older and felt pressure. Elena's response was that she loved me, but she understood Patricia's concerns and that she was hoping I'd grow into the kind of provider she needed. I sat there reading these emails, and I felt like I was watching our entire relationship rewrite itself in real time. Every time Elena had defended her mother's comments, every time she'd made excuses for Patricia's behavior, it wasn't because she was conflict avoidant. It was because she agreed with her mother. I was a project to her, someone she was trying to fix. And the worst part was realizing that she'd never seen me as enough. Elena called again around midnight, and this time I answered. She was staying at Daniel's place, and her voice had that tight, controlled quality that meant she'd been crying but didn't want me to know. She said she needed space to think, that I'd put her in an impossible position, and that maybe in a few days, when we both calmed down, we could talk about this like adults. I asked her if she'd been emailing her mother about me behind my back. The silence on the other end told me everything. She started to stammer, asking how I knew about that, and I told her I'd seen the emails, all of them. She tried to explain, said it wasn't what it looked like, that she was just venting to her mother, that everyone complains about their partners sometimes. I asked her if everyone tells their mother they're hoping their partner will become a different person after the wedding, and she went quiet. Then she said that I was taking things out of context, that I was invading her privacy, and that if I loved her, I'd understand that she was just working through her feelings. I told her I did understand. I understood that she'd never actually wanted to marry me. She'd wanted to marry the version of me she thought she could create, and I was done being a project. She started to argue, started to cry, but I hung up. 3 days of silence followed, and I spent every one of them planning my exit. I thought about proposing to Elena, how I'd spent weeks planning the perfect moment. Took her to the beach at sunset, got down on one knee in the sand, and she cried and said yes. Now I realized she'd been imagining her mother's reaction the whole time, calculating whether I was acceptable enough. I called my buddy, Mike, who owned a moving company, and told him I needed help with something and that I'd pay him double if he could come first thing in the morning. He showed up at dawn with his truck, and I had a system. Anything I'd paid for was mine. Anything that was clearly hers stayed. The couch I'd saved up for. The TV I'd bought for football Sundays. The coffee maker, the gaming console, the kitchen table I'd refinished myself. All of it went into Mike's truck. I left her clothes, her art supplies, her laptop, all the designer bags and shoes, but I took back everything I'd contributed. The engagement ring was sitting in a dish on the dresser, and I pocketed it because that ring represented a future that was never real. While I was packing up my tools from the closet, I found a folder tucked behind some of Elena's old portfolios, and curiosity got the better of me. Inside were printed copies of the emails I'd seen, plus others I hadn't, including one where Patricia had offered to pay for Elena's wedding to someone else if she'd break up with me before the engagement. Elena had declined, but her response wasn't that she loved me too much to leave. It was that she'd already invested too much time in the relationship and wanted to see if I'd improve. I took photos of those emails with my phone, not because I wanted to use them, but because I knew Elena would try to gaslight me later, and I wanted proof of what I'd seen. Mike helped me move everything to my new apartment in one trip. As we were unloading, he asked what happened. I told him about the emails, and he let out a long whistle and said I dodged a bullet, that a woman who talks about you like that to her mother will never respect you. The new place was smaller, quieter, and mine. That first night I slept better than I had in months. On the third day, I sent Elena a single text telling her she could go back to the apartment whenever she wanted and I'd left my key in the mailbox. She responded an hour later with a wall of text, and I didn't read most of it. She called 6 times, and on the 7th call, I answered. I told her I'd taken what was mine, that I was off the lease, and that I'd found the printed emails in the closet. She went silent, then started crying and saying I didn't understand, that she'd never meant for me to see those, that she was just confused and working through her feelings with her mother. I told her that the problem wasn't that I'd seen them. It was that she'd written them, and that I finally understood I was never going to be enough for her because she didn't actually want me. She wanted someone else wearing my face. She demanded the ring back, and I told her no, that when she chose her mother over me at that dinner table, she gave up any claim to it. There was a long silence, and then she said I was cruel, that she'd thought I just needed to cool off. I told her that was the problem. She'd expected me to come crawling back like every other time she or her mother had criticized me, but she'd finally pushed too far. I told her to have a good life and hung up. 2 weeks later, Elena went back to the apartment and saw what I'd done. My phone exploded with messages, but I'd already blocked her number. She tried reaching out through friends, and I sent one group text with screenshots of the emails to everyone who'd contacted me. No commentary, just the proof. The messages stopped after that. Some decisions feel sudden, but they're really the result of 1,000 small compromises that finally hit their breaking point. That Christmas dinner wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the moment I finally admitted what I'd been ignoring, that Elena had never actually loved me. She'd loved the idea of fixing me. The fallout from the emails was swift and brutal, at least for Elena. When I sent those screenshots to the mutual friends who'd been pressuring me to take her back, the narrative changed overnight. People started reaching out to apologize, saying they hadn't known the full story. A few admitted they'd always thought Elena seemed calculating but hadn't wanted to say anything. One friend told me that Daniel had actually called him and said he was glad I'd left, that he'd watched Elena do this to 2 other guys before me, and he was tired of watching his sister treat people like audition pieces for her perfect life. Apparently, Sarah had refused to be in the wedding party because she didn't think Elena was marrying me for the right reasons, and that sympathetic look she'd given me at dinner suddenly made a lot more sense. Work became my sanctuary. 3 months after the breakup, I got promoted to crew lead. The validation felt incredible. Not because of the money, though that helped, but because it proved that I was good at what I did, that my worth wasn't determined by Patricia's standards or Elena's secret shame. I moved into a better apartment with a balcony where I could watch the sunrise with my coffee, and every single thing in it was something I'd chosen. 6 months out, I started dating again. I met Chloe at a friend's barbecue, and she was a teacher, funny, and genuine, with this ease about her that came from actually liking herself. When I told her what I did, she asked real questions, wanted to know about the technical side and the danger. When I mentioned the breakup in passing, she said, anyone who needs their parents' approval to love someone isn't ready to be married. That's when I knew she was different. Christmas came around again, and Chloe invited me to her parents' place. I was nervous, but her dad, Tom, was a retired mechanic who asked about my truck. Her mom, Brenda, was a nurse who made fun of both of us for talking about engines during dinner. When Tom asked about my job, really asked, and I explained the technical work we did, he said, "That's good work, important work." I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tight. No qualifiers, no comparisons, just respect. Life settled into something sustainable, work, Chloe, beers with Mike on Fridays, and no drama. Then, 13 months after that Christmas dinner, Elena showed up at my door on a Tuesday night. She looked smaller than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. She asked if we could talk, and I stepped outside and closed the door. She started talking fast, rehearsed, telling me she'd cut Patricia off, that she'd been in therapy, that she'd changed, and realized she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. She said if I'd give her another chance, she'd prove things could be different. I listened to all of it and felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just certainty that this chapter was closed. I told her I was glad she was working on herself, but it didn't change anything. She started crying, asking what she could do, and I realized she still didn't understand. This wasn't about her mother. It was about the emails, about the fact that she'd spent 2 years seeing me as a project, someone she was trying to fix into being acceptable. She asked if there was someone else, and I told her yes, someone who'd respected me from day one. Elena's face crumpled, and she asked if I'd ever really loved her. I told her I'd loved the version of her I thought existed. But that person was never real. She begged, literally begged, said she'd do anything. I thought about Tom saying that's good work, about my balcony mornings, about the peace I'd built, and I said no. She stood there crying, then said I was making a mistake, that I'd regret this. I told her I wouldn't. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She said Daniel had told her she was an idiot, that he tried to warn her I was the best thing that ever happened to her, and that Patricia had already ruined 2 of Elena's relationships before mine. She said Daniel had actually apologized to Sarah on her behalf after that dinner, and that Sarah had told him if he didn't stand up to his mother, their engagement was over. Apparently, Daniel had finally confronted Patricia, told her she'd destroyed Elena's chance at happiness, and Patricia had blamed me, said I turned both her children against her. Elena said she'd lost everything, her mother, her brother's respect, most of her friends after the emails got around, and that she'd moved back home only to realize Patricia was never going to change. She'd spent a year in therapy undoing the damage, and she just wanted me to know she finally understood what I'd been trying to tell her. I told her I appreciated her saying that, but it didn't change my answer. She asked about the ring one more time, said it would help her move on, to let go of that last piece. I told her I'd sold it, which was partly true. I'd actually donated it to a charity auction for first responders. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and said she hoped I was happy. I told her I was, and I meant it. She left, and I went back inside to find Chloe making tea. She handed me a mug and said she was there if I wanted to talk. I kissed her and said I was good. A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that Patricia had shown up at Daniel's house demanding to see Elena, and Daniel had told her Elena had moved to Denver and didn't want contact. Apparently, Patricia tried to blame the whole thing on me, said I'd poisoned her children against her, and Daniel had finally told her the truth, that she'd spent years tearing Elena down, and he was done watching it happen. Sarah had backed him up, and they'd gone no contact with Patricia entirely. The last I heard, Elena was doing okay, working as a designer in Denver, and she'd started posting on social media again, but this time it was just her work. No quotes about relationships or betrayal, just art. I hope she'd found some peace. As for me, I had everything I needed. The truth is, some people show you who they are when things get hard. And Elena showed me that I'd always be a project to her, someone to improve until I was acceptable to her mother. Walking away wasn't about punishment. It was about choosing myself, about refusing to spend my life trying to measure up to someone else's arbitrary standards. The day I walked out of Patricia's house, I chose my own worth over someone else's approval. And I'd make that same choice every single time. Because the life you build trying to please people who will never be satisfied isn't a life worth living. What do you think about this story?